Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Damon Hewitt, Executive Vice President at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation about advocating and advocacy in the wake of hate. The Lawyers Committee is an organization founded in 1963 at the behest of then President John F. Kennedy to marshal all of the prowess and resources and power of the private bar in service of the mission for civil rights and for racial justice. The James Byrd Jr. Center was dubbed in honor of the late James Byrd Jr. earlier this year as part of Lawyers Committee's ongoing effort to address the impact of hate crimes and hate incidents against African Americans, against Black people, people of African descent in this country, those who we've lost, whom we'll talk about today, and also the lived experience, to address the lived experience of people who are survivors of those hate incidents and people who live through the regular indignities every day, from civilian vigilantes to state violence and racism and hate of all forms, violent physically, violent emotionally, violent psychologically. Today's conversation is not a conversation about police violence in particular, but it's very timely. This conversation has been planned for some time, and it's certainly in the spirit of all of the issues and advocacy standing up for Black lives. It's considered part of this broader movement for Black lives, frankly. And today's conversation is really more about the ways that people who are loved ones and allies and spiritual kin even of people lost to racist hate violence have engaged in advocacy in ways that address the structural violence that is done to Black people in this country, especially how to do or undo some of that with respect to legislative and policy methods, even though those are not the only ways for sure. So just a quick announcement. For those who are attorneys who are seeking CLE credit, please email us at stophateproject@gmail.com, stophateproject@gmail.com for any follow-up details. I believe you are aware that the certification for CLE is pending. We'll introduce our special guests in a bit, but just a few other logistical notes just about agenda. Number one, we'll start with a basic legal overview, which is necessary for CLE credit and also informative for our audience as well at the federal level and also with respect to Maryland at the state level, as we'll discuss. Then we'll have a discussion with our special guests, our panelists whom I'll introduce. And then hopefully time permitting, we'll be able to entertain some Q&A and discussion from the audience. We are in a virtual environment, obviously, as it is a dynamic environment. You can see some of our guests here with us. And we really appreciate their time, and we will introduce them appropriately in just a few minutes. But first, I want to turn to my great colleague at the Lawyers Committee and at the James Byrd Jr. Center to Stop Hate, Jennifer Wachuku, to start us off by giving us a bit of a legal overview, but also telling us a bit about the individuals whose lives and legacies inform today's event. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Damon, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again for joining us for this webinar and such an important discussion. So as Damon mentioned before, we have a discussion about the legal frameworks. I just want to take a moment to provide some additional information and context about the lives that we will be discussing today. So first, I'll begin with Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, who was a Bowie State senior about to graduate with plans to serve our country when he was killed in May 2017 while waiting for an Uber on the campus of University of Maryland, which is in College Park. The man who stabbed Second Lieutenant Collins was active in an online alt-right racist group. And although prosecutors used evidence of the defendant's white supremacist ties to bring a hate crime charge during the trial, ultimately these charges were dismissed by the judge because the prosecution couldn't prove that race was the single motivating factor. And we'll learn more about that in the legal discussion and from the Collins family. Urbanski was convicted of first-degree murder, and his sentencing was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Collins family advocated for the Richard Collins III law, which modified Maryland's hate crime statute to motivated either in whole or a substantial part by hate. And again, we'll learn more about that in our presentation. And this change recently became law earlier this year. James Byrd Jr. On June 7th, 1998, Byrd, a Black 49-year-old father of three, had just left a friend's anniversary party and was walking home when a pickup truck with three white supremacists picked him up. They drove to an isolated rural road where Mr. Byrd was brutally murdered, and his murderers were convicted of capital murder. Thanks to the tireless activism of the Byrd family, the country's hate crime laws were strengthened at both the state and federal levels. In 2001, Texas Governor Rick Perry signed the James Byrd Hate Crimes Act into law, strengthening the penalties for bias-motivated crimes in Texas. And in 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which strengthened the legal tools available to prosecutors to bring assailants to justice. And finally, Vincent Chin was a Chinese-American man who was beaten to death by two white men, Ronald Ebens, a Chrysler plant supervisor, and his laid-off auto worker stepson, Michael Nitz. Eben and Nitz used racial slurs while attacking Chin, believing that he was Japanese and responsible for stealing American auto worker jobs. Eben and Nitz pled guilty to manslaughter and received a $3,000 fine and 3 years probation with no jail time. The president of the Detroit Chinese Welfare Council at the time deemed this to be a $3,000 license to kill Chinese people. But the case has also been viewed as a turning point for Asian American civil rights engagement. Vincent's race in the police report was listed as white because Michigan's crime statistics only offered two choices and stopped it from being seen as a hate crime. And this information is relevant because as we discuss the legal frameworks for our federal and state hate crime laws, you'll see that there are commonalities and key points about the ways that the hate crime laws are structured at the federal level, as well as important nuances and points to highlight about the ways that various state laws are structured. And so with that, we will begin our legal discussion. So first, we'll start with a quick primer on hate crimes. Hate crimes are criminal offenses against people or property that are motivated in whole or part by an offender's bias against race, color, religion, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. Hate incidents are a broader category of incidents. And this is important to note because hate incidents may not actually constitute a criminal offense, but they're still perceived as being motivated by prejudice or hate. There are a number of incidents that we hear about on a daily basis through the news, social media, and other platforms. And while they may not rise to the level of a crime, they still may be motivated by prejudice or hate. And so those are still categorized as hate incidents. And finally, it's important to note that hate crimes are message crimes. And as we've talked a little bit about before, hate crimes do target individuals. And we'll hear about that more from our panelists today. But they also affect entire communities. And so with hate crimes that we have heard about in the news, whether it is the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, or a Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the Kroger shooting in Louisville, Kentucky, and many others, hate crimes have impact on entire communities. Next slide. So there are a number of federal hate crime laws that are at prosecutors' disposal. For the purposes of today's discussion, we will focus our attention on 18 USC Section 249, which is the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. Next slide. So the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act is a very unique statute. Of note, it is a statute that takes into account willfully causing bodily injury or attempts to cause bodily injury. So this is a statute that focuses on actual physical harm or attempts to cause physical harm to someone because of bias towards a person's perceived or actual race, color, religion, or national origin. The Shepard-Byrd Act is the first statute that protects sexual orientation and gender identity at the federal level. And for protected categories other than race, prosecutors have to show that there's a connection with interstate commerce. And so in cases that have been prosecuted in the past, it may be a car that is driven across state lines, or perhaps the dangerous weapon that's used. For example, my home state of Louisville, or home city of Louisville, Kentucky, you might have a Louisville slugger bat that might be used to commit the crime. And so that might be an example of interstate commerce. And again, as it relates to physical violence, threats are not protected under this statute. And the Shepard-Byrd Act has an interesting language as it relates to the crimes being committed because of a person's perceived or actual race, color, religion, or national origin. And we'll hear more about this as we talk about Maryland state law, and in particular, the advocacy work that the Collins family has done, because there are some instances where you have mixed motive cases, where it may be because of someone's race, color, religion, or national origin, and possibly other factors as well. And finally, the law acts as a backstop to state laws. And so the Shepard-Byrd Act is available as another option in order to prosecute hate crimes at the federal level. Next slide. So at the state level, there are some states that do not have hate crime laws, such as South Carolina, Georgia, Arkansas, Wyoming, and Indiana. Indiana, for some individuals and organizations, it is a question as to whether their current hate crime statute, as it's written and defined, actually is a hate crime statute because of how broad the language is. But there are other states that have varying degrees of protection within their hate crime statute. And hate crimes can also exist as standalone statutes or penalty enhancements. So the statute can either operate on its own, or it can operate in conjunction with what we know as our common assault or other kinds of statutes, and add additional penalties if it's proven that the crime has been committed because of bias based on the protected categories at state law. Next slide. So now we'll briefly talk about California's hate crime law. So in California, hate crimes are defined as a criminal offense against a person or property motivated by race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. So in a lot of ways, California's statute mirrors some of the things that we have previously discussed about the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Next slide. California is one state of many that also has civil laws available as well for individuals who've been targeted by hate. So one statute that is available to individuals who've been targeted by hate is the Unruh Civil Rights Act, which states that all persons within California are free and equal, and is designed to protect the rights of Californians from arbitrary discrimination. There's also the Ralph Civil Rights Act, which prohibits violence or intimidation by threat of violence. And again, this is focused on acts that are committed against people or property because of specific characteristics. And there are civil and administrative remedies that are available to individuals in California, as well as the ability to file a private lawsuit. And there's also the Bain Civil Rights Act in California. And this statute prohibits interference or attempted interference with threats, intimidation, or coercion. And this statute gives victims of hate crimes or hate violence the power to bring private lawsuits in order to get injunctive relief to prevent the harm from continuing to take place and monetary damages. And it also allows for the California Attorney General or your local district attorney or city attorney to be able to bring a civil action also for injunctive relief and for civil penalties. Next slide. And then finally, we'll talk about Maryland's hate crime statute as it currently exists. And I will give the Collins family the opportunity to talk about the fabulous work that they've done in the changes that they've made to the Maryland hate crime statute, which will go into effect in October of this year. But briefly want to go over the statute as it's currently written. It prohibits crimes against people and property because of a person's or group's race, color, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, gender, disability, national origin, or homeless status, which is different from a number of other states because of the specific protected categories that exist in Maryland. And of note, gender identity is not a separate protected category in Maryland, but it's included in the definition of sexual orientation. And within Maryland's criminal statute, it includes attempts and threats to commit crimes against people or groups, deface, damage, or destroy a person or group's real or personal property. So either their home, their land, or personal property, a car, and things of that sort, or to burn objects on a person or group's real or personal property. So that is a brief overview of Maryland's hate crime law. And with that, that concludes the legal framework and overview, and I will turn it back over to Damon to continue with the rest of this afternoon's program. Thank you.
You're muted, Damon. Damon, you're muted.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that, Frank. So, we for today's conversation, what we want to do is obviously educate the public and our audience about these hate crime statutes. And as a reminder, anyone who has questions about the hate crimes laws specifically, or any materials or CLE credit, please email us at stophateproject@gmail.com. But we also want to go a bit beyond that and really talk about how these families, how these individuals have advocated, along with allies, and advocated for change and justice in the wake of these tragic incidents, and also explain how some of the advocacy may be applicable to the movement moment, hopefully it's more than a moment, of today. To join us, we have our special guests. First, you heard the voice of Frank Wu. Thank you, Frank, for the reminder about the mic. He is currently the William L. Prosser Distinguished Professor at UC Hastings, and he is soon to be, or he is rather, the president designate at Queens College in New York. Frank grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where Vincent Chin was killed, and he has spoken and written so eloquently about the personal impact of Vincent Chin's murder and the advocacy that followed in both scholarly articles and also in the popular press. So thank you so much, Frank, for joining us. We're also joined by Rick and Dawn Collins, the parents of the late Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III. The Collins families advocated for the Richard Collins III law, which modified Maryland's hate crime statute, which you heard about already, and you'll hear more about shortly. It recently became law earlier this year. They also established a foundation in their son's name in August of 2017. Thank you so much, Rick and Dawn, for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. And last but not least, we're joined by Luvan Byrd Harris, the sister of the late James Byrd Jr. Luvan and the Byrd family committed themselves to fighting hate with love after they lost James. They created the Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing to promote cultural diversity and fight hate crimes. And thanks to their tireless advocacy, the country's hate crimes laws were strengthened at both the federal level and the state levels. Thanks so much, Luvan, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great. So, as we get into this conversation, we know that for Rick and Dawn and Luvan, legislative advocacy has been part and parcel of what you have done in terms of your response. Your families have each engaged in legislative advocacy in the wake of these crimes. Can you talk to us about why that advocacy was necessary? What form did your advocacy take? And did you encounter any unique surprises, curveballs along the way? Maybe we can start first with Rick and Dawn.
Well, thank you again for having us and to help explain our story. Needless to say, we were quite surprised when the hate crime law was thrown out, when the Judge Hill, stated that the bar had not been reached to prove the hate crime. And fortunately for us, we had a state's attorney who was willing to work with us. When that was thrown out, needless to say, that was a gut punch to us to hear that that was not going to happen, the hate crime part. So we met, and it was at that point, it was decided, let's go to Annapolis and let's change the law so that no parent would have to feel the hurt that we were feeling and the disgust that happened at that time. So needless to say, we had groups like yourself, the Lawyers Committee, and several other wonderful, wonderful people to help lobby in Annapolis and get that law changed.
So much.
Yeah, and to add to what Dawn just mentioned, this, us being just laypersons, to hear the discussions around what the standard was for a hate crime, it seemed to me to have too much vagueness in it, and it was something that was written almost, in my mind, a legalese that we couldn't understand, because it was pretty clear to us after seeing the evidence that was presented in the courtroom. You either are or you aren't someone who's dabbling in hate, white supremacy, or not. Because, and I liken that to the same instance as if someone was dabbling in child pornography. You either are or you aren't. There is no gray area in between as far as we could see. But I felt that the dismissal of the hate crime charge was as if it was making some sort of excuse for those individuals that would engage in that, to give them some cover. And I thought that was very offensive, particularly given our case, our son standing there in a public setting with witnesses and on videotape, to see that he would be, number one, targeted and actually attacked, and then someone want to make an excuse for that behavior. It just left a very bad taste in our mouth.
Well, thank you. And it should go without saying, but I think it's important to say rather that we understand that when you retell your story, when you hear the story retold, it can be re-triggering, re-traumatizing. Not everyone is up for that, and that is okay. But we appreciate the fact that you continue to do it, standing up not just for your son, whose image we see in the background, but also for all the other families as well. So, one of the interesting takeaways from the trial, the fact that the hate crime charge was dismissed by the judge before there was even a jury verdict, and that the fact that you had to advocate for legislative change, it's almost as if sometimes the law doesn't speak to actual human experience. It's almost as if, we feel the intense pain when we lose someone and when there is a crime, even if it's non-fatal, but it's as if the law struggles to capture the degree of moral clarity that you feel in terms of the outrage that you feel. When you did testify, we know that the law was subsequently modified earlier this year. What kind of audience did you receive in the Maryland legislature? And do you feel that the changes that were made are changes that you think are I won't say sufficient, but are really important and strong steps in the right direction?
Well, we did receive, we received a positive, welcoming audience in the Maryland legislation. The law was passed overwhelmingly except one individual. So that was a wonderful thing. Senator Benson, who sponsored the bill, and Senator Wilson, Delegate Wilson, they were very open to hearing what we had. And again, our what we had to work with is, again, the state's attorney. Something that I've also want to say, that why is it very important for people to know they're down balloting, who is representing them. And State's Attorney Brave Boy was willing and able to go forward and help us with this endeavor.
Fantastic. As we switch to Levon, and thank you, Rick and Dawn, once again. We know that the advocacy takes many different forms, and there are many different people who've been victimized by racist hate. We're joined today in the audience, not as a participant in the audience, by Susan Bro, the mother of Heather Heyer, who was killed in Charlottesville. We appreciate her work and her advocacy, honoring the legacy of her daughter, her loved one. But Levon, tell us a bit about your advocacy and those same questions. What form did it take? Any surprises along the way? And any important stands that you had to take at the federal level or the state level in the course of your advocacy?
Well, during that time, like 20 years ago, 1998, you can imagine the feel of a small town, the South, you're dealing with the South as well, to have that type of hate crime. So first you got to go over the shock that someone felt necessary to get an African-American man and drag him till he fall apart. And once you get over that shock, then you realize, okay, these guys need to be punished. And it was so surprising that when we got to the punishment, there was no hate laws on the books at the time. There were hate laws, but they were weak. No one ever been convicted on those laws. And so we had to decompress from that because we knew that we had a fight on our hands, because what my brother went through was very horrendous, and there's no law to protect my brother. And so we realized that we had to fight for justice. And so you're dealing with pain, you're dealing with grief, you're dealing with the South mentality, and then you have to also fight for just the same time. And we felt like there has to be a change, because I'm sure there's other victims that never have got trial correctly because there's no hate laws. So we had to only do it for James, but do it for other victims as well that did not get justice. And we got calls all over the world saying, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? So we had a choice to speak for peace, because we didn't want any more blood to shed. But at the same time, we wanted justice. And so we grieved, but then we had to also go to 3 trials. And each trial, we had to hear groom details. And the reason why is because there's no hate crime law that convict them unless you have 2 offenses. So we had to prove my brother was kidnapped first and then killed. So imagine as a family going through the gruesome detail, at what point did he die? At what point was he bound, and things like that. And I felt it was unnecessary, unfair for a family to have to hear the gruesome detail as you grieve just to get justice. And so that kind of ignited us to say we need to have a strong hate crime law. So in the state level, it was a struggle. It was years and years of advocacy and allowed us to get this bill passed. And even though we want it passed, they want to compromise the language in the bill. And we can take some things out, and we have a bill named James Byrd Hate Crime Bill. Well, no, it kind of sounds good, but it wasn't fair to other people, other families. So we say either everybody's gonna be covered or no one. And so we went back and forth with that, and finally we got everybody uh, under the law, included in the law, and we got it passed. And because at the time, the governor at the time was Governor Bush, and he felt like all crimes are hate, and we had to prove that all crimes are not hate. When you single a person out, because they didn't know James, they saw his color, his skin, and they want a message to the Black America. This is what we feel about you, and so we had to singleize that and make them realize that not all crimes are hate, but the hate crime is more deeper because that's a message for the whole world. And he never got that, so he never did pass the law. But Governor Perry, when he replaced him, he did got these state level bill signed. And then we had the federal, same thing. You know, people feeling like, you know, all crimes are hate. Why have a special law for people for hate when hate is always over the world? So we had to go through the same advocacy, getting people involved and getting people to believe that hate crimes need to be increased or as decreased, and by having better laws. And we feel that the law can change people, but it starts deeper because there's law on law now, but person have a heart to kill, they're gonna kill regardless. They want a message for the world. But we kept going and got to be persistent in what you do. And so we got the Shepard-Byrd hate crime law. So now federally, we feel like we can ensure people think twice that if we do something against someone else, you got to be willing to pay the price for it. Unlike it was 1998, where the guys felt like no one will happen to them because there's no law. So they had no fear in them. So now we're hoping that these laws will put fear in people to think twice. It may not limit all crimes, but it's a start somewhere.
Right. Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick follow-ups for you. One is that at the federal level, you know, I understand there were some efforts to drive wedges between communities. And I remember just reading about and hearing even from our great team at the Byrd Center, at the Lawyers Committee, how it was so important for you to take a stand of solidarity. Can you talk about that and with whom you were in solidarity?
Well, when you're in a situation where there's hate crime, you got different people. Some people for you, and some are not for you, and some want to do the race card, and some say, okay. So you had to decide. Justice is the most important thing, and so you got to stand your ground on what you know is right for everyone, and not just take sides on the race of the people or the gender of the person, whatever. Because no one have a right to take anyone's life. No one has that power in the world because we all were born as a human being. There's only one race, and that's the human race. And people need to realize that. But when they try to take matters in their hand, and we feel like the law belongs to them, then we have a problem. So we had to take a stance against anything around us to do the right thing we felt like was right. And in doing that, surprisingly, I didn't know that there's maybe once in the life of America that a white man being put to death for killing Black, and the first in the state of Texas. And those numbers was very shocking to us. And so we realized that, okay, it has to stop. And so that's why we went to solidarity to make sure that everybody's covered, that no one have to do that. Go through the problems we went through at this time, but it's a fight. It's not gonna come easy. You got to be consistent and believe in what the cause is. And that's what kept us going at that time.
Right. Thank you. And you know, one other community with respect to solidarity is the LGBTQ community, and I know you took an important stand as well alongside Matthew Shepard's family and the Matthew Shepard Foundation, which is one of our other partners here at the Lawyers Committee and the James Byrd Jr. Center to Stop Hate. You know, you mentioned, LaVon, something you heard, I think, from either a prevailing line from either then Governor Bush or from others about all crimes are hate. It kind of reminds me of this notion that all lives matter. And, you know, yes, true, tell us something we don't know. But until Black lives matter, do all lives really matter? And then as we think about that concept and also think about solidarity, I want to turn to you, Frank Wu. Frank, you've written so much about the murder and the advocacy following the murder of Vincent Chin. And in 2012, you penned an op-ed in the New York Times, which I found just really enlightening. And it was entitled, "Why Vincent Chin Matters." You ended that piece with this line: "Everyone who cares about the promise of our increasingly diverse nation ought to see in this case the possibility of social change arising from tragic violence. And I wonder if you could just talk, Frank, about the impact that Vincent Chin's death had on you personally, growing up in Detroit, in the Detroit area, and also what it means more broadly for the Pan-Asian community, which is a very diverse community.
Sure. I'm so humbled to be part of this panel. Thank you. This crime occurred June 19th, 1982. Vincent Chin was out celebrating a bachelor's party. He was due to be married. His attackers used a Louisville Slugger baseball bat, and they literally cracked his skull open. So with blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter pooling onto the pavement beneath him, he lapsed into a coma. They'd used racial slurs, they'd used obscenities. I won't repeat them here, but they had said, according to witnesses, it's because of you, little fill in the blank, that we're out of work. Meaning that even though he was of Chinese descent, an American, working class, salt of the earth, just like them, to his attackers, he represented Tokyo and Toyota. This was at the height of a terrible recession when people were worried that Japan was going to take over. It was in the Motor City where everyone made cars. That's why we were there. My father worked for one of the big 4 US automakers. So this case changed everything, not just for me, but for so many Asian Americans. There are 3 aspects of the case that I want to highlight. The first is, like in many of these cases, the killers never denied it. They never disputed that using their own muscle and this baseball bat, they had bludgeoned someone to death. Just like in these other hate crimes, there's never a dispute. The person shot the gun, used the knife to stab someone, drag someone to death behind a pickup truck. It happened, and there are witnesses. That's clear. What they always dispute is their motive. They say, oh, no, we're not bigots. Here they said it was just a bar brawl that had gotten out of hand. And I always wonder, how can people think that they're innocent if they say, oh, trust me, I wouldn't ever hate anyone, when it's clear that they killed somebody. And we can't ever look into someone's hearts or minds and know for sure. But when you look at all the circumstances, you have to wonder how it could not be racial, just as you have to wonder about so many of the cases that we see now. The second aspect of the case is that it inspired people to stand up and speak out. There was a protest movement such as the world had never seen before. Asian Americans marching, giving speeches, writing letters to the editor, angry, participating instead of being quiet and submissive and deferential, what some had called the model minority. This was mistaken identity twice over. People who hate aren't very precise, and it wouldn't have been right for them to have found someone Japanese, but this was someone of Japanese heritage, not Chinese, and someone who was Vincent Chin was an American, not a foreigner. So they just picked someone who they thought represented everything that they hated. That's what else is in common here. You take an individual who has nothing to do with what you're angry about. You shouldn't be that angry to begin with, but then you take it out on somebody who stands as a representative in some way. And in this case, the defense lawyers actually argued Orientals, that was the term in use then, couldn't use the civil rights laws. They actually made that argument. They lost on that argument. So this is an example, and it's so important to emphasize this. The historic struggle for Black equality, which has been a priority and should be, and to this day, has benefited all of us directly and indirectly. It's so important to pay respects and to acknowledge that at the forefront, both in the terrible crimes, lynching, when we see the photos, you have to avert your gaze because it is so painful to be confronted with those grainy photos and people celebrating as if it were a party, that it was African Americans who bore the brunt of this systematic violence which persists. And the last aspect, so the second is that this was a protest movement that came out of this tragedy. But the third is that it was an opportunity for bridge building. When I was a kid growing up, they used to say, you all look alike, Chinese, Japanese, and they had those chants and the other things they would say, the common cruelty of the playground, the bullying, the teasing and taunting. And when you go to Asia, you realize, you know, to generalize, Japanese and Chinese and Koreans and Vietnamese, they don't think they're all one people and they don't necessarily like one another. But here we have a common cause. And so to be Asian American is to build bridges and to say, we're not tourists, we're not sojourners, we're equals, we're citizens here to stay. This is our homeland. And I want finally to close by saying it was the NAACP chapter in Detroit, then, and I think even now, the largest in the nation, that helped Asian Americans who were new to all of this protest. And the NAACP endorsed this movement. Jesse Jackson was one of the first speakers at the rallies for Vincent Chin. So there is an opportunity here for us, people of good faith cooperating to counter all the demagoguery, the divisions, where everyone is being told, look at your neighbor and coworker and blame them for disease and recession and go after them. We can and we must in the United States do better than that.
That's true.
Thank you so much, Frank. You know, your words just remind me of you know, great thinking of people like John Powell about othering and belonging, and how it's, you know, easy to overlook someone, to hurt someone, apparently to kill someone, to allow the racist mind to do that when you think someone's another, when you think they're not like you, when you think they're somehow subhuman. Just a reminder that racism is the pandemic that's been killing us for so long. And that, you know, part of the cure is obviously justice, structural justice, ending structural racism, but also the way that we as, you know, ordinary people, whether we're lawyers or professors or have lost a loved one or not, the way we can stand in the way we can make a difference is by standing in solidarity. And I wonder, you know, for all of you, Frank included, would you look at this, what I call a protracted movement over the last several years, the advent of the modern movement for Black lives and the solidarity we've seen across other communities, what's your great hope or your big advice in this moment when it comes to standing and banding together, not in a sanitized way, but in a very clear and bold way to address this pandemic of racism?
Well,
I have to say, I'm pained when, oh, I'm sorry, were you asking me?
For everyone, but maybe if we turn to Levon first.
Oh, yes, please, please.
well, I think that, well, I know that hate is a learned behavior. And so anything that's learned can be unlearned. And I think that it starts with the home. And kids really sponge off of what they hear in their families. And so if to get together and see the solidarity of people standing for a cause without violence, saying that we have a voice, because the victims don't have no voice anymore. It's to the family to be their voice for them. And I feel that as long as we can show America that we are still one group of people, when we cut our blood, all is red, and that we also fear each other because we don't know each other. Once you get to know the next person next to you, sometimes you have to go to another, don't do what's comfortable, but do things that's uncomfortable so that you can learn more about others. But majority of people sit with the people they know. It's this common thing people do. You know, they want to be with people they know about. But if you kind of change it a little bit and go to places where you never go before or tip somebody different, you say, okay, that's a cool person. That's a cool race of people. I don't have no reason to fear them, because fear is usually caused to hate. And then when they don't know you, they feel like you're superior to them and they kill you. They have no motivation but hate. And so I think it's a learned behavior. And I think once we get out our box and make a change and for us learn more about others, rather than judging them for what they see on the outside and find what's on the inside, that should have a lot of impact. And to see the solidarity of people walking together hand in hand, saying we need to make a change is very important right now.
Thank you. Frank?
I think it's so important to show people a common cause, that to be a good ally means not appropriating someone else's anguish, but knowing that there are ideals, principles at stake. And when we stand up for those principles, we help ourselves to show people at the compelling gut level in concrete terms that the same people who hate African Americans, who hate Jews, who hate gays and lesbians, Well, most of them hate Asian immigrants too. And if people don't understand that, it leads even those who face prejudice to perpetuate it. I have to say, nothing pains me more in this struggle than when I am among other people who are Asian American, who they know what it's like to confront bias, especially with this pandemic, as even those who are doctors and nurses on the front lines are told, you caused this guilt by association on a racial basis. Yet, I'll tell you, I'll share with you, and I don't think this will surprise you. There are more than a few who, behind closed doors when they're comfortable, they will utter the most terrible things, no different than a KKK member or skinhead. And I struggle because I want to figure out how do we explain to them that's that's morally wrong. It isn't just morally wrong. It's just plain stupid, and that foolishness within our communities, we have to address it constructively and give them a reason to say, yes, I too. So there are many young Asian Americans now trying to explain Black Lives Matters to their elders, to their parents, who as newcomers to this nation, just like many citizens, they don't know this history. They don't know Brown versus Board. They don't know massive resistance. They don't know segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. They don't know about Reconstruction and everything else. So if you just arrived from Mars or China and looked around, you wouldn't understand any of this without seeing the structures, the history, and everything else, the legacy of the past that bears down upon us.
Thank you so much. Anything else to add, Rick and Dawn, on that point?
Well, I just like to say that, it seems that there's a sense that the current movement with the protests since the George Floyd killing that has taken place, there seems to be this, I don't know, it's not spoken, but underlying current that, well, let's see, how long is this going to continue? But my thoughts are this has to continue indefinitely until the appropriate level of change takes place. And the reason that I feel that way is sort of piggybacking on what Frank just said. Behind closed doors, there's some people who will utter the same things that you witness acted out in this case with James Floyd or George Floyd. But what we have to do is to let the country know that we recognize that this is a systemic problem. It didn't just happen overnight. This was baked into the very fabric of the nation. So it's going to take the same level of effort to make sure that we keep the feet to the fire of those elected officials, other public servants, and every institution, whether it be public or private, that either you're going to be for justice or you're not. Choose now which side you're going to be on.
So well said. So well said. I want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our guests in the time remaining, please email them to stophateproject@gmail.com. Again, that's stophateproject@gmail.com. I want to open up, as we await any other questions, just a space for our guests. If there are some concepts or queries you have for each other, we have maybe just a few minutes for that. No compulsion, but I want to open up that space. It's hard in a virtual environment to have a full conversive discussion as we'd like to in person, but I want to open up the space. If there's something you want to say to each other about your respective fights and struggles and the journeys that you're on.
Well, I'd like to commend the Rick and Dawn Collins family for taking the stance and through your grief of losing a child, and to still have that sprint to say, I want to make a change for the whole state of Maryland, and to get there and just go get on hold to get it done. I'm sure your son will be very proud that through your pain, you made a difference and made a change. And to Professor Frank, I admire you for taking up a cause that that's very much needed, that's people don't hear about. And this first I've heard about it. And so you enlightened me a lot about the different ways that the Asian have been discriminated against, and it's not forefront as it should be. And I admire you for stepping out and making a difference as well.
Thank you.
As well as you, Levon. We commend you to borrow old time saying, staying on the battlefield for your brother.
Absolutely.
I'm sure there are times that you get weary and you get tired, but you know you have a mission. And Frank, again, kudos to you. And I would say that would be the thread that binds us or run through all of us, that we get tired, and but we also know that we have to continue this fight, because no one can say it like I can say it. Because see, Richard was my child, and I had to see him in a casket. No mother should ever have to see their child lying in a casket for such a heinous crime.
Thank you. We do have a few questions that have come in. One is about the work, Levon, Rich, Rick, and Dawn, that you're doing through your foundations and the names of your loved ones. Can you just maybe give a quick plug, I guess, so to speak, or update about the foundations that you founded them and what kind of work you're up to? We can start maybe with Rick and Dawn.
Yes, really, to encapsulate it, we decided that the first thing for this was to work on getting the strengthened hate crime legislation in front of the Maryland legislature. So we were fortunate that we had a strong prosecutor who agreed that that was something that needed to happen. And it happened, what we're told, in record time. Yes. Because typically it takes much longer than just a couple of months to get that type of sort of landmark legislation passed through the bodies of the representatives. So we are very fortunate that we had a prosecutor in State's Attorney Braveboy that was willing to partner with us to get that done. So that's what I would take away from it. And part of our foundation is to continue working on issues related to social justice, and particularly with civic education, so that people, everyday people, can have a better understanding of the representation that they have, and just what it means to be a citizen. That's what we want to use our foundation as a vehicle for, to let people understand what their civic responsibilities are, and what the responsibility of the government, for which they come under in their communities, does to represent them.
Correct. Levon?
Well, the Byrd Foundation started like 1999 or 2000, because we got so many calls. I guess if you're not in a situation, you never know what's around you, because people live an isolated life all the time. So you get calls for something that happened, and we hear so many stories about what happened to their loved one. Because we're dealing with the South, and no one got justice, and how can we help them? And we're not counseling more people than I can even name a number. And so we said that James don't have a voice, so we need to do something so the people who don't have a voice, that didn't get heard, would have a voice to get heard. And so we established the Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing. And our motto is to stop the hate, educate, because I feel like education starts with learning what you don't know, and to be equipped with things to be able to communicate, understand either race of people and genders and things of that nature. And then when we started that, we started hearing a lot of stories about how people are walking around with a lot of hate and how a lot of things inside of them. And through that foundation, we did the oral history project, where we just ask people, tell their story. Because some people carrying stories from their grandfather, their great-grandmother, what was done to them, or what they heard their best friend. And it burdens them to a point where they hate these people for something they heard or that's done to their ancestors down the line. And when they talk about it, they heal. And because when you talk about it and just get rid of it, then you feel like, okay, now I can go on with my life. And so that's one of the main projects of the Byrd Foundation, is the Oral History Project. And it was very successful. We've collected like these 2,500 stories via auto, and we hope to house it one day in the Library of Congress. And that's one of the steps we feel that people need a voice, and people need someone to care enough about them to say, how have hate or discrimination affected your life? A lot of people carrying burdens around that no one asks that question, and you wonder why they're upset or mad about something. So once they talk about it, it heals from it.
Right.
And then Jasper's is like a country town, so we realized that people don't have ways to get education. So we try to do a foundation so that give them scholarships, so you can have a incentive to go to college, to educate themselves. And so we're proud that we was able to get scholarships during the time for the last 15, 20 years, and we're still trying to collect money, for them to have an opportunity. Because in small towns, there's very limited opportunity. You walk all day, look around, and then nothing to do, you get in trouble. And so we're trying to deter the young people, to raise them a different way of thinking. And the people in Jasper now, young people, they weren't born during time 1908 when James was born. And so so you weren't here, but this is the history of what happened here. And so to make a difference, let's make a change. And on the 20th anniversary, we did a bench down at the courthouse, which was history, to have a bench. My brother, a bench with his name on it, and says, be the change you want to see in this world. So when kids pass by, if you want to make a difference in Jasper or the world, you be that change starts with you. So the foundation was very much needed at the time, and it's still needed even more so now, what's going on now in today's society. But we feel like that's something James would want to do, continue to spread the word about peace and try to educate people about hate.
Thank you so much. Another questions come in about the notion that racist hate crimes are really message crimes. They're not so much just about the individuals whose lives were taken or who are targeted for hate, but it's about everyone like them. And so I think about the impact and the context in Jasper, Texas, on the campus of University of Maryland, College Park, where Richard was murdered, in Detroit. So we kind of get it. We talked earlier about the advocacy, the mobilization, even what we see right now in the streets, which I think, Rick, you so eloquently said must continue. But can you all talk about maybe starting with Levon, then Frank, and then the Collins family, just briefly, the impact that these tragedies have on other people like the loved ones who were lost, and why it is that folks became so galvanized and so impacted, and for many people continue to live looking over your shoulder in fear.
Well, the impact was because it was so unexpected. Because a lot of times you go through life thinking all was well with the world. You're close to your family, you go to your family day and everything. You think, oh, there's no hate, because you haven't been affected by hate until boom, that day comes where you're affected by hate, and then your whole life is turned upside down. And that was the thing that happened in Jasper. We had our side of town, and the white had their side of town, and it was all was white with the world. And so what made the impact was someone just really came, invaded that, and thought, oh, I can get away with something in this small hick town, so let me just do it. And it really scared everybody. Really, it was something that no one expected. So with that being said, we had to deal with the white Americans who felt guilty, and also there were white Americans who wasn't feel guilty, who still wanted to walk out and wear their white sheets during the time. We also had to deal with the Black Panther, who still wanted to say, this side with us too. So we had to make a decision to stay in the middle and speak for peace. But it's not easy to do when you really feel like you was robbed. And hate crime, when you leave somebody for hate, you feel like that person robbed you of your loved one just because they felt like their life was more important than theirs because of something where they was born. And so Jasper now, they want to forget it. And for the anniversary, we as a family have to do everything ourselves. No one ever came to us and say, you know what, we're gonna keep James' memory alive. So it's like a stain on the town and no one wants to be remembered. And And we're sorry it happened in Jasper, but we can't not let it just slide away. And so the impact would be if we ever leave the town, then it'd be like nothing happened to James, and we can't let that happen. And so you have to continue to bring it up and do anniversary and do workshops to get people to realize this happened in this town. We cannot let this happen to anyone else again. And so it's a constant fight. There's no end. You always can be doing something to bring about justice. And like I say, his grave got desecrated twice. Even at death, he still wasn't in peace. And that was like really a stab in the heart. You mean tell me you kill him and then you come back to his grave and then try to kill him again. So it's a constant work to try to keep his name alive in the town of Jasper, what they want to forget about.
So almost like the racism is not a ghost, but it has an echo effect.
Right.
Frank, can you speak to this question about how the murder of Vincent Chin was a message to the Pan-Asian community, especially in Detroit in that context?
These cases are about who belongs and what a city or town or that park, who it belongs to. They're about turf. Vincent Chin, and in almost all these cases, the victims, they didn't set out to be icons or martyrs or heroes. They were just going about their lives. They were ordinary folks, and that should be celebrated. Sometimes people say, well, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that doesn't quite get it, because we all have a right to be there when we want. Because when you say it's the wrong place and the wrong time, what you're saying is some of us always have to know our place and wait our time. It's to say, remember your station in life. So these cases, they're so powerful. They're symbolic. When we look at them, we think, there but for the grace of God go I. And the more people who feel that, the more our movement can be sustained.
Absolutely.
Great. Rick and Dawn, anything to add?
Well, I would only add that I agree with what Frank is saying, because the person that murdered our son did not know that he was a military officer, quote unquote, America's finest. Our son was slated to be an intel officer and graduating from college in 2 days. So you would say we did, or he did, everything you were supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And then to be standing on the streets of an institution of higher learning, just standing there, and someone were to take his life, it lets you know no one is safe as long as this monster of racism is alive and well in this country.
And just to add to the backstory of this, it's one of those things that has been going throughout society. This is not something new. This is a generational thing, and it has affected our family from previous generations. So this is, I hear people talking today about they've had enough. Well, I'm so far beyond fed up with it that I can't go back. We got to press forward. And one other thing I want to say is, it's almost as if when people hear about it, basically going back to Levon's point, they kind of want you to be quiet about it. They don't like being reminded of it. It's almost as if you're offending them again by bringing the topic up. They don't want to face it, and you make them uncomfortable. Never mind how uncomfortable we are in feeling the threat daily. It's more important that they should feel comfortable in their skin, by not having to confront this issue.
Great. Well, we're a little over time, but we have a few technical legal questions that have come up, and we will make sure that in the materials we send out that we endeavor to answer as many of those technical questions as we can about the hate crime statutes and provisions. I just want to note that there are 4 states that don't have a state level hate crime statute at this point. And if I understand correctly, there's Arkansas, Georgia, South Carolina, and Wyoming. The Georgia statute, there was a statute, but it was struck down by the state Supreme Court And I know that in the wake of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, there have been renewed calls for that, and controversial calls, because we know so many times laws designed to protect us sometimes go the wrong way, that they are misapplied or not faithfully enforced. And so, I just heard you all say we can't go back. We can't turn back from here. And so I just wanted to close by hearing from each of you, maybe starting with Rick and Dawn, and then Luvan, and then ending with Frank. Just in today's climate, with everything that's going on, that is both kind of scary and exciting at the same time, and sad and somber, but profound as well. How are you navigating? How are you processing all of this emotionally, psychologically, strategically? And also importantly, what can the audience, the advocates, the lawyers, the lay people do to support families and stand with all of you today and going forward? Where do we go from here?
So I'm going to say, thank God for the family and my support system around us, because there are days we ebb and we flow. That's the best way I can describe it. As I first stated, no parent should ever have to feel this type of sadness, and it does not go away. You feel it daily. But to the audience, band with the foundations, band with the people who are doing something about this, because as my husband said, we will never forget. We will never forget. We will never be quiet. And we have a work to do. This one thing I want to add, I call it the enemy. They're out proliferating their cause on predominantly white institutions. So we have to be vigilant and point them out and uncover this madness.
Yeah, we have to continue to make it uncomfortable for them to come out, and we need the help of everybody. Everybody has to be united. All people of moral cause have to be united and resolute in that. No, we're not turning back.
Thank you, Rick and Dawn. Luvan.
Well, as I watch things on the TV and how the world is at a chaos, it really saddens me and the family that you would think 1988 will open eyes to a lot of people, and other crimes have happened between that time, and that having a state law and a federal law to deter people from that thinking, that mindset that they deserve to kill someone or harm something. It really saddens us, because as a family member, our hope was that the work we put into making these laws, that it'll change people's hearts and change their mind. Then I realized that you have to change the heart. The heart is not changed, and the law is not going to deter anybody, because hate comes from in and out, and it's a disease that's tearing up our society. And so when I see it, I just say there's not give up hope, but no, there's still a lot of fight we have to do. And so I'll actually advocate to continue to fight, be persistent, and don't stop until you get everyone covered and everyone back on one accord, and that is one race, the human race.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Frank.
This is an historic moment. We're all aware of that with COVID-19, with Black Lives Matter. We're always living through history. Time is always going forward, but we don't usually catch ourselves. We don't think to ourselves, this is a moment. And our children, our grandchildren, they will want to know, what did you do? What was it like then? And we have an obligation to them right now to create that better world for their sake. And we have this duty because we are so self-conscious that it is not just a historic moment, it's a calling to us that we must march, we must protest, put the face mask on, and go out there in solidarity. So I can't think of another moment in my lifetime I don't think there has been a moment anything like this with what is happening in the world. So this is a moment for us to make good on a promise of a diverse democracy that we have made to ourselves. It is an ideal that we aspire to. We have not yet achieved it, but we can.
Professor Frank Wu, Levon Byrd Harris, Rick and Dawn Collins, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your words, your insights, and for bringing us into your fight to make it everyone's fight. The work that you do literally helps every day to broaden the circle of human concern, so that we can be reminded to make true the notion that Black Lives Matter, so that we can make true the aspirations towards solidarity across communities of color and across all people, but not in a watered down way, but in a way that is bold, a way that is strong, and a way that is unending. We thank you for the work that you've done. We invite those of you in the audience, if you haven't felt like you've done your part yet, to find ways to connect with us here at the James Byrd Jr. Center to Stop Hate at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, to connect with the foundations of the Harris family and, the Byrd family and also the Collins family, and to connect with all of the allied work that is happening. If you haven't been in the streets protesting, if you haven't made your volunteer contributions, if you haven't made financial contributions to aligned effort, now is the time. You know, as Frank said, history continues to march on. I'd like to think, and we probably thought this before, but that maybe everything isn't okay, but we believe, we pray, we hope, we strive, we have faith that we're going to be all right. But we'll only be all right if we band together, if we make this a real inflection point for the future and create the future together that we all want, that we all deserve. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this effort, being part of this family. We appreciate you.